Come midday on the 22nd of January, Ketchewayo's army was moving speedily and decisively to the assault. Despite what was perhaps a miscue earlier in the day, with part of his army being spotted by the British, now the full weight of his army was bearing down on the British camp. They had pushed the British troops, which had seemingly been sent out to reconnoiter, back to the Inyoni Ridge, and even now the Zulu forces were occupying the high ground. With positive sightings of the advanced guards of Zulu regiments all along the Inyoni Ridge, 2 companies in action on the Tahaleni Spur, the guns of N Battery ranging on Zulu forces at the Notch, Pauline needed to collect his forces and make a stand. Before carrying on with the video, I might remind the viewer that this is in fact the 5th such video in the series, based on my trip to South Africa in 2019. Now I realize that the series has been somewhat spread out, and if you're in need of some refreshment regarding the background to this video, or have not yet watched the previous chapters, may I humbly recommend them to you. It was now clear to Pauline that the main threat to the camp lay to the north. To this end, he consolidated the defense of the camp in a long, extended line, which ran along a rocky outcrop that stretched from the northern extremities of the camp down to the donga that ran across the face of Amatuchain. The guns of N Battery, with A Company in close support, were seemingly in a decent position to cover a wide arc of ground. Certainly, the position on the Tahaleni Spur was too far in advance to be secure in its flanks and still protect the camp. Therefore, the position on the spur would have to be withdrawn. It must be remembered that throughout the morning, the overlying direction from Chelmsford at the Mangeni was that the column was to continue its advance to the east. He had issued direction to Pauline to move at least that part of the camp that was needed by the forces with him. It's important to layer this oblivious direction over top of the emerging threat posed to the camp. With both companies in action on the spur, they needed some support to assist their retirement, and Pauline deployed C Company under Captain Younghusband to act as a covering force, whilst F and E Company, and presumably what was left of the NNMC and the NNC, retired down the hill. This was accomplished with little drama, if in a degree of haste. This put 3 companies, C, E, and F, on the rising ground north of the camp, overlooking the low ground at the foot of the escarpment. The Inyoni Ridge had been abandoned to the enemy. Somewhat concurrent to this, Pauline had also deployed the remaining companies of the 24th to further extend his line to the east. H Company, under Captain Wardell, and Charlie Pope's G Company of the 2nd Battalion deployed on the right of the line past where the guns and A Company had already taken up position. So, to recap, with the intermediate Zulu advances bringing them to the Inyoni Ridge, the consolidation went something like this. To cover the withdrawal from the spur, C Company was deployed north of the camp. This facilitated the retirement down the escarpment of E and F companies, as well as presumably the NNC, any remaining NNMC, as well as the picket line from Amatuchain to Mkweni Hill. The Zulus were then free to dominate the high ground, and E and F Company withdrew back up towards the camp. Around this time, with the continuing Zulu advances, H and G Companies were deployed to the right of the guns and A Company. There were 6 companies now deployed, as discussed, in a long, extended line, stretching from the northeastern slopes of Isandlwana along a rocky rise of ground that paralleled the Inyoni Ridge, until it fell away into the Neogani Donga at the foot of Amatuchain. This brought a certain degree of cohesiveness to Pauline's position. Some say that the line extended even farther, up the slopes of that conical hill. Perhaps a pause here to discuss what this deployment would have looked like. As explained in previous videos, the default fighting formation of the infantry of the era was in extended order. Movement to contact, advancing and retiring in the face of the enemy were all evolutions that would see this formation used. For administrative movement, i.e. movement forward or back between positions while not in contact, movement in fours would be used often. Let's take the deployment of the companies to the right flank as an example. Now, these companies, of course, had been stood to for the second time that morning once the Zulu threat had begun to materialize and reports of great numbers advancing towards the camp had been received. At this time, the companies would have been standing on their parade grounds in front of their respective camps. They would have been formed in 2 ranks and in quarter column. That is to say, the companies in line but arranged one behind the other, at a distance of 1/4 of their frontage from the company in front. Once orders to deploy were received, and with considerable distance over rocky and somewhat broken ground to cover, they might have been turned to a flank and formed 4s, giving a more manageable formation to navigate independently to their positions. We could easily imagine G and H Company performing these simple movements, and their snaking from the flank forward towards the already deployed A Company and the N Battery guns. Once in position, the company would front and reform its 2 ranks. To place in a better context, here we see a diagram of a company advancing in 4s. Once in position, the company would halt, front, that is to say turn, in the direction they had initially been facing, and reform their customary 2 ranks. The company would then extend, most certainly in this case, from the left. This would see the files turn to the right and march a designated distance, then halting and fronting on their own. This would see the files, or pairs of men, spread out across a much wider frontage than if found in close order with the men shoulder to shoulder. It was in this position that the company would wait until either called on to move or to commence firing. The companies that had deployed to the spur would have done so in a very similar way. Alternately, the companies, already formed facing the direction they were to move, could simply move forward, stepping off in quick time, in close order, and in line, moving at the trail, then forming to their left once the alignment with the position was gained. Once on their proper alignment, the company would then extend, as previously discussed. There was one more important part of the evolution to understand, and that was the formation of rank and tire. Immediately preceding the commencement of fire, the rear rank man would move up to the left of their front rank man and occupy the interval between, thus having the distance between men. Therefore, there was a subtle but important differentiation between the extension, given in paces, and the actual spacing of the men on the firing line. Now, all of this seems a bit convoluted and unnecessarily complicated to the modern eye, but I assure you, all of these maneuvers were well known to all and could be conducted with absolutely no difficulty whatsoever. Maneuver and musketry were, after all, the primary tenets of the infantry. Now, this kind of thing is of great interest to me, as it forms the very basics of understanding battlefield events. And at the risk of being a bit indulgent, perhaps, I hope it is of interest. This level of detail is important, however, in understanding the intricacies of the deployment of the companies of the 24th. The formations and dispositions of the companies on the day have been discussed, misinterpreted, and misrepresented over time, and although most serious students are unanimous in their appreciation of the deployment, it is for the benefit of the viewer that this examination is done. In order to estimate what the deployment looked like, we must first estimate the distances involved. The crest of the rocky ridge ran in a lazy S, being most advanced on the left flank. From there, in the shadow of the mountain, to its terminus at the donga in front of Amatuchain is just over 1,700 yards. If we can allow for fire to cover the low ground on the right, perhaps a frontage of 1,500 yards might be more appropriate. Divided by 6, 250 yards, minus a 25-yard gap between companies, leaves a frontage per company of about 225 yards. So let's use that number to calculate the distance between men on the firing line. If we can assume a rather healthy strength for the company of about 80 all ranks, we can then interpolate that there would be about 35 files, 4 sergeants, a drummer, 2 subalterns, and the commander, a captain. Now, many companies were deficient the requisite number of leaders, some only having 2 officers. This is somewhat immaterial as it pertains to the frontages occupied by these various companies. As calculated, when extended, the company would have a frontage of 225 yards. Divided by the 35 files, this gives approximately 6.5 yards frontage per file. Remember, when the company extended, the files remained intact, i.e. front rank in front of the rear rank. As calculated, the gaps between files was 6.5 yards. This equates to 234 inches, which in turn, using the regulation 30-inch pace, equates to an 8-pace extension. Remembering that when the company was actually in action, firing against the enemy, the company formed rank entire. Doing so split the interval between the files, giving each man a frontage of 3 1/4 yards. This equated to a space of 4 paces between men while in rank entire. Now, we'll never know for sure the exact strengths of the companies in the line, their frontages, or their extensions. We do have good evidence of the general formation, that of extended order, supplied by not only doctrine, but also eyewitness accounts. Were there greater distances between companies? Was the extension 8 paces? What were the actual strengths of the companies in the line? These are questions that have to be left to educated guesses. Now, there is no doubt that given the early days of extended order doctrine, that the 8-pace extension, as calculated here, was large, bordering on excessive. The less density in the line, the lower the levels of control and cohesion. 4 paces between men would give each sergeant about 50 yards of frontage to control, 25 yards each way. And it is not outside the realm of possibility. Add in the assistance of a corporal or two, and it becomes quite workable. The other key aspect that frontages and density speak to is, of course, firepower. As we shall see shortly, when firing commenced, there appeared to be little doubt that whatever the extension used on the day was, it was enough. So far, we've discussed in detail the deployment of the 6 companies of the 24th. But what of the native troops, the NNC and the NNMC? Some sources state that parts of the line were held by various groupings of the NNC. There were some 5 companies in and around the camp at this time. Indeed, part of the blame for the defeat has been levied upon these very men, accused of running away, thus leaving huge gaps in the line. Now, they may have indeed run away at a critical moment, but I do not subscribe to these companies holding their own spot amongst the companies of the 24th. It must be remembered that the companies of the NNC were of nominal 100-man strength, and were only equipped with about 15 firearms, enough for some 50 yards of frontage if extended at a 10-pace interval. Thus, to have the whole company in the line would serve no purpose in a fight that was intended to be settled with the martini. Therefore, I subscribe to the theory that the NNC were held slightly to the rear, acting as the second line, more properly known as the supports in the fighting terminology of the era. This way, they could act in close support should it come to actual blows, their limited firepower augmenting the companies in line, and their mass of spear and shield-wielding ranks moving up to support any forthcoming hand-to-hand action. This would also make conventional tactical sense, as supports were a critical piece to any deployment puzzle. On whether the NNC rifles, some 15 per company, were detached and sent forward remains suspect to me, as these arms were primarily in the hands of the NCOs of the company, and if they were off forward in action, then who would be there to supervise their men? Of particular note are the observations made by Smith Dorian, introduced earlier in this series. In his sketch, he places the NNC companies behind the line, as discussed. The various positions are noted by X's on the map. The other group that we have not yet dealt with, really, since the initial contacts earlier in the morning, were the volunteers and the Natal Mounted Police. We of course know that the Natal Carbineers had provided the vedettes out in front of the camp, and some were undoubtedly with Durnford, withdrawing in the face of the Zulu left horn. The remainder were most assuredly in and around the camp. Their numbers were quite small, and we can only assume that they were not in the line. Later, Pillane would give the instruction to, quote, march all men out of the camp who can carry arms. And at that point, more than likely, any of the volunteers then left in camp would have paraded and moved to supporting positions behind the line. It's important not to understate the possibility of alternate deployments to that shown here. Lieutenant Curling of the Royal Artillery observed and recorded that the companies were quite small, no more than 50 men in total. Given the general numbers on the ground that day, any reference to woefully understrength companies might probably be due to various individuals tasked with other administrative duties. Some of these men may have been employed in the preliminary steps of breaking at least part of the camp. Now, if we look at the numbers in general, a reduction from around 80 to 50 all ranks is quite significant. This would represent a reduction in frontage of about 1/3. Had the companies deployed to the firing line with such strength, they probably would not have been anywhere close to reaching the bottom of the rocky ridge. And this point is important, because evidence has been found, in the form of spent cartridges, indicating that indeed the firing line did extend that far. In an interesting bit of correlation, there seems to be some merit in the 8-pace extension as discussed earlier. The default extension was 4 paces, as outlined in the field exercise and evolutions of infantry. It could be greater in less critical situations, such as the inherently indecisive evolution of skirmishing, versus the more decisive attack or defense evolutions. Chelmsford had issued orders to double the extension as part of his instructions issued before the campaign. This had raised the eyebrows of a member of his staff, but there is no indication that there was any subsequent change. Almost conveniently, this places the extension at 8 paces, precisely the distance we arrived at earlier in the discussion. Despite the somewhat academic application of paces, distance, extension, and spacing, as well as which units were where, there remains a huge amount of unknown information. I suppose that it really is truly academic, as once the deployment was finished, the companies were soon in action, and by most accounts, their position and their fire was effective. So there we have it. Pillane had collapsed to the rocky ridge in contact, and was facing what appeared to be the main threat to the camp. There were other factors at play, however, that he was as yet unaware. For Durnford, who had ridden out to the east with 100 of his mounted men, the rocket battery and its NNC escort had not yet reappeared round the south slopes of Amatuchain. This was key, as Pillane did not, and perhaps rightly so, consider his right flank to be in peril at this moment. But, as we shall see, this was to be the very spot that would cost him the battle. At this point, the 2 guns of N Battery had been engaging Zulu forces at the Notch, at ranges of around 3,000 yards. This was far outside the range of the Martini, so, in the east anyway, the infantry had yet to come into action. The effective range of the Martini was 800 yards. Indeed, British infantry shot annually out to that range and were expected to hit targets measuring 6 feet by 8 feet wide. At that range, volleys behaved much like a burst from a machine gun, and this beaten zone effect was what the Zulus must have initially felt. As we can see by this diagram, with the companies deployed on the rocky ridge, the Zulus were free to descend the escarpment and to organize before coming to grips with their enemy. Only on the left flank, C Company and perhaps some of F Company could fire reach the Zulus on the spur. In what was almost certainly concurrent to the British deployment, the Zulu chest and part of the left horn began to descend the Inyoni Ridge and organize for their attack. At some point here, the N Battery 7-pounders switched their fire from the Notch at extreme range to engage closer targets more to their front. Musketry of the era was generally a highly controlled evolution. It was delivered in one of 2 ways: volley fire or independent fire. Volleys could be controlled at any level, all the way up to 1 huge battalion volley. While in extended order, however, especially when extended to the degree that they may have been at Isandlwana, more likely than not, the volleys would have been controlled at the other end of the spectrum, the section. On the command from the company commander, section volleys from the right or left, the section commanders would then issue the executive orders to fire. On the command present, the section would bring their rifles to the shoulder and fire generally together, although without the command fire. This was a peculiarity of British musketry until 1881. Typically, the sections would fire in sequence for one complete evolution. after which they would generally fire in their own time as circumstances permitted. The second technique was independent firing. This was used when the enemy was extremely close, or in other circumstances where volleys were not appropriate. It was the rapid fire of its era, and while not delivered at a specific rate, and indeed conservation of ammunition was always paramount, it could afford a greater overall volume of fire all along the line. On the command commence, the men would first alternate their fire, after which they would fire in their own time. Let's look how C Company may have come into action on the left flank after they had withdrawn to the high ground, subsequent to the retirement of E and F Company. Upon arriving at their new position, they would have fronted and extended as already explained. Now, there was a bugle signal for such a movement, but chances are, at company level, it would not have been used. It's included here for the sake of interest.
From the right, 2 paces, extend!
Now please note here, the extension is much too short in this example, being only a couple of paces. As discussed, it may have been as much as 8 paces between files and 4 paces between men in rank and tire. With the files extended, the company would then begin engaging the Zulus at long range on the Tahaleni spur. In the perfect world, with the battalion deployed and the enemy steadily advancing, perhaps a bugle would have been used to signal the commencement of firing. Now this was far from the drill square, and more than likely, Captain Younghusband, already in contact with the Zulus on the spur, would have moved quickly to engage. Again, here, the bugle is used for a bit of context. Due to his frontage of some 200 plus yards, he would have delegated the actual control of the firing to his subalterns and sergeants, who could fight the individual sections within the company.
Section volleys! Fire!
Upon the direction to open fire, the rear rank men moved into their intervals, and the sergeants began selecting their targets. Their targets, of course, were the Zulus on the Tahaleni spur, who were now attempting to follow up the retirement of E and F companies. Concentrating on groups rather than individuals at this long range, the fire nevertheless would have been telling. The 4 sections of the company may have been initially coordinated in their firing, but shortly after were probably acting on their own, as conditions and targets were favorable. The section commanders would have estimated the range and issued their orders.
Fire a volley! At 800 yards, ready!
Calmly setting their sights, they would have then waited for the executive command to fire.
Present! Ready!
Once committed and firing at a given range, the drill was relatively simple.
Present!
Ready and present.
Ready!
Firing this way served a number of functions. One, it controlled the expenditure of the precious ammunition that had to be carried by either hand or by wagon up from depots, such as that at Wilkes Drift. It also allowed for smoke to clear.
Present!
This was a common feature of the black powder Victorian battlefield.
Ready!
Lastly, it preserved a sense of calm, forcing the men to approach their musketry steadily and resolutely in the face of the enemy. Thus directed, the line gradually came into action along its entire length, as the Zulu screen advanced and the range closed. The Zulus weren't some sort of unsophisticated mass. They advanced cunningly, using rushes and available cover. Perhaps little known, the Zulu army was heavily armed with firearms. Typically older, obsolete patterns, even muzzleloading, they nevertheless kept up a considerable, if somewhat ineffectual, fire during most of the attack. On the left flank, the ground was mostly visible right the way to the spur. But in the center and right, the rocky ridge was unable to command the low ground out to the foot of the escarpment. As the Zulus massed and began advancing to within rifle range, the companies near the guns of N Battery, A, and perhaps E Company, as well as H, advanced some ways to their front before engaging the Zulus. You see, due to the nuanced shape of the ground, those at the crest of the rocky ridge had an unobstructed view of the forward slopes of the Inyoni Ridge, and, had it been in range, could have easily engaged targets on it. But, as the Zulus descended the escarpment and advanced into the low ground, they became invisible. fire from the rocky ridge would pass harmlessly overhead. Therefore, by adjusting their positions, advancing some distance onto the forward slope, the companies were able to bring the dead ground to their front, and the Zulus hiding therein into their direct observation, and subsequently suffer their fire. The Zulus used their fieldcraft to advance some ways towards the rocky ridge, but were eventually stopped by the musketry of the 24th, augmented perhaps by this time by small groups of the native contingent and the volunteers. The upper reaches of the Nyilgani formed the low ground between the escarpment and the rocky ridge, and the Zulu centre was able to get in amongst the folds in the ground and seek shelter from the punishing musketry. It must also be noted that the grass was quite tall at this time of year, and that went a long way towards concealing their ranks as well.
Ready!
There were observations made that day regarding the shooting of the 24th. It was remarked by survivors that the men were cool and calm,
Present!
even joking about accuracy and who was shooting better.
Ready!
Veterans indeed. The rocky ridge, especially lower, down closer to Ematuchain, gave excellent cover among the many rocks, and the men would have taken the opportunity to use this in whatever way suited, kneeling or lying.
Ready!
Remember that especially as the Zulus got closer, there was fire directed at the British, even if somewhat ineffective.
Present!
The volleys continued, and soon the whole line was in action. It mustn't have been that long after the line came into action that perhaps the most important development of the day became apparent to Pauline. Durnford and his men came into view, out past Ematuchain. They were still out on the plain, and were returning after the unfortunate demise of the rocket battery at the Notch. Durnford's 100 mounted men, all armed with carbines, had met the Zulu left wing as it descended the heights and began its wide sweep to the left flank. Durnford had been using classic mounted infantry tactics to achieve a measured, controlled withdrawal in the face of greater numbers. Dismounting, engaging briefly, then mounting and moving. This had the desired effect, and the Zulu advance had been unable to move at best speed. At some point, Durnford knew he had to make a stand and offer determined resistance. As he rounded the southern slopes of Ematuchain, he decided to halt in the Nyilgani. This would provide a sort of reverse slope position, well suited to defense. The Donga was deep at this point, able to conceal the horses as well. Climbing the eastern bank, Durnford's men had a fantastic defensive position, excellent fields of fire up a long, exposed slope. The Zulus would be silhouetted as they advanced. Durnford had been in action for some time, and his men were only carrying a bandolier's worth of ammunition. After fighting his way back to the Nyilgani, his men's supply of ammunition was already somewhat depleted. Accounts describe the action as busy and hotly engaged, with Durnford dismounted, directing fire, and giving encouragement, even occasionally assisting his men to clear stoppages. Despite this tactical involvement in the action, and really, how could a man in command of only 100 men in such a location not be? He did evidently maintain some awareness as to what the Zulus around him were up to. Despite their strong position, Durnford's men could not maintain it indefinitely. Two aspects would see the position at the Donga become untenable. The first, of course, was the aforementioned ammunition issue. The second was the Zulu numbers and their maneuvering capability. The left horn and the left flank of the chest were gaining momentum and began to maneuver around both sides of Ematuchain. The immediate threat to Durnford was the presence of enemy to his left, but also to his right, as the considerable numbers of the left horn began to feel around his flanks. He sent a call for support up to the main line on the rocky ridge, and received some in the form of fire from one of the end battery guns, which was redeployed a bit to the south in order to achieve this. Presumably near this time, with the Zulus beginning to make moves into the gap between Pope's G Company and Durnford, the British right made an adjustment. By refusing the right, the threat now developing on and around Ematuchain could be met, and although there was no hope of connecting with Durnford, perhaps fire could dissuade any infiltrators. It was perhaps at this time that Lonsdale's NNC Company moved to the right flank. There, they would assist in protecting G Company. This stage of the battle saw perhaps the last moments of stability and cohesiveness. The companies of the 24th were firm and in good position, with good fields of fire, and their musketry was holding the Zulus for the time being. What happened next would tear the very fabric of the position apart, as the Zulus capitalized on their greater numbers, deft maneuver, and the British inability to cover all approaches. The endgame was about to begin. So this marks the end of Part 3C of the South Africa series, Chapter 3 of the Isandlwana story. In the next video, we'll discuss the collapse of the firing line, the last stand, and the plight of the fugitives, as well as provide some analysis of various aspects of the battle, and discuss some myths and legends. I'd like to thank friend of the channel Georgina, who accompanied A Company 24th Foot on our trip to South Africa. She was our official photographer, and some of her photographs have been used in this presentation. Of course, my invitation to the trip was at the behest of the Die Hard Company. I wouldn't have been in South Africa without them. The Die Hards weren't alone, and they were joined by the Queens to form A Company 24th Foot. This was the combined group that went to South Africa. And as mentioned in previous videos, the works of Ian Knight and Mike Snook, perhaps the most eminent authors on the subject. For all your Snyder or Martini reloading needs, talk to Martin at X-Ring Services. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. And for more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page.
The hills are alive with the sound of music. What?
Your jump wasn't high enough.
We'll see about that. It's not supposed to be high, it's supposed to be skipping.